In the fall of 2017, a wildlife biologist named Marcus Delaney was tracking Florida panther movement through the deep interior of the Big Cypress National Preserve when his GPS unit led him to a place that shouldn't have been there. It was an island, roughly 2 acres of elevated dry ground rising out of the cypress swamp, accessible only by wading through knee-deep black water for nearly a quarter mile in every direction. He'd been through this part of the preserve dozens of times. He'd never noticed it before because it's the kind of place you can only find on foot, in exactly the right season, when the water is low enough to reveal the approach. What he found on that island over the next 4 hours changed the direction of his career and opened an investigation that is still ongoing today. There were 20 objects on that island, not scattered carelessly, not washed in by flooding, arranged, deliberately, carefully, intentionally arranged across a patch of ground at the island's highest point, protected by a natural overhang of cypress root and limestone that had kept them somehow mostly dry. Some of them were ancient. Some of them were stranger than ancient. And a few of them have no explanation that any specialist called in to examine them has been willing to put their name on publicly. Subscribe right now and don't go anywhere, because we are going to go through every single one of these 20 objects. And number 1 is the reason this island may rewrite what we know about who was in this swamp and why. Number 20 is going to seem almost ordinary by the time we get to the end, so let's start there and work our way into the deep end. Number 20 was a ceramic pot, broken into 11 pieces but essentially complete, resting in the depression of a large limestone rock as if placed there deliberately. The clay body of the pot was a buff-colored earthenware tempered with sand, and at first glance it looked like a standard piece of pre-Columbian Florida pottery, consistent with the Glades tradition, the cultural complex that archaeologists use to describe the indigenous peoples of South Florida from roughly 500 BCE through European contact. That would have made it interesting but not extraordinary. What made it extraordinary was the decoration. Running around the upper third of the vessel was a band of incised geometric designs, repeating triangles and interlocking diamonds that Glades tradition ceramics almost never feature. This pot was decorated in a style that resembled ceramics found not in South Florida, but in the St. Johns River region of Northeast Florida, more than 200 miles away. Either this pot was made by someone far from home, or someone carried it a very long distance to bring it here. Either possibility means the island was a destination, not an accident. Number 19 was a piece of carved bone, roughly 5 inches long, made from what analysis later confirmed to be the femur of a white-tailed deer. One end had been sharpened to a fine point, and the other end bore a series of parallel incised lines arranged in groups. A tally, or a notation of some kind. Bone tools of this type are common enough in Florida's archaeological record, but the incisions on this one followed a pattern that a specialist in indigenous recording systems examined carefully before concluding that the groupings, sets of 3, 5, 3, 7, 3, 11, follow a progression of alternating odd numbers that does not match any recording system she had previously documented in the southeastern United States. The bone had been rubbed with what appeared to be red ochre, a pigment associated across many cultures with ritual significance, with the dead, and with the marking of things that matter. This was not a tally of deer or fish. Someone was counting something else entirely. Number 18 was a shell mask, or the remnants of one, assembled from fragments of lightning whelk and olive shell that had been drilled and laced together with fiber that had mostly decayed. At roughly 8 inches across, it would have been large enough to cover a human face. The drilling technique was precise, and the arrangement of the shell pieces created a stylized face with hollow eyes, a wide mouth, and what appeared to be ear spools on either side. Masks of this type have been recovered from Key Marco, the famous archaeological site on Florida's southwest coast excavated in the 1890s, where an extraordinary cache of carved wooden objects, shell tools, and ceremonial items was found preserved in the muck. But Key Marco is on the coast, easily accessible by water. This island is 23 miles from the nearest navigable waterway of any significance. Someone carried this mask through the swamp. Whether they brought it to use it or to leave it is a question that remains open. Number 17 was a piece of worked wood, about 14 inches long and 2 inches in diameter, carved from cypress in a form that the first archaeologist to examine it described as a staff or scepter, though she was careful to call that a provisional interpretation. The wood was remarkably preserved, almost certainly because the tannic acid in cypress swamp water had effectively tanned it over the centuries. The surface was carved with a continuous spiral groove running its full length, ending at the top in a small carved figure that had been mostly eroded, but retained enough detail to show a head and what might be raised arms or wings. Similar carved wooden objects were part of the key Marco cache. The radiocarbon date on this piece came back to approximately 1100 CE, placing it within the period when the Calusa, the powerful indigenous civilization of South Florida's Gulf Coast, were at or approaching the height of their political and cultural influence. The Calusa controlled vast networks of trade and tribute across South Florida. They built their world in and around water. This island, remote as it is, falls within the territory they would have claimed. Number 16 was the first object on the island that made Marcus Delaney stop and photograph it before he touched anything else. It was a flat stone, sandstone by appearance, about 6 inches square, covered on both faces with deeply incised lines forming a pattern he could not immediately interpret. Florida does not have abundant natural sandstone. The nearest deposits of sandstone suitable for carving are in northern Florida or Georgia. This piece of stone had been carried a significant distance before anyone cut into it. The symbols on its surface were photographed, enhanced digitally, and sent to specialists in indigenous art and writing systems. 2 responded with observations that pointed in the same direction without either being willing to commit fully to the conclusion. The symbols include forms that resemble elements of the southeastern ceremonial complex iconography, the shared religious art tradition that connected Mississippian cultures across the interior of the continent from roughly 800 to 1600 CE. A flat carved sandstone tablet on a remote island in the Big Cypress, bearing symbols that echo a continental religious tradition, is not what anyone expected to find here. Number 15 was a bundle of cypress wood sticks, 11 of them, each about 8 inches long, bundled together with braided plant fiber and wrapped in a piece of animal hide that had survived only in fragments. The sticks themselves had been carefully smoothed and were each marked with a different number of small incised rings around their circumference, from 1 ring on the shortest to 11 rings on the longest. Bundles of marked sticks are a documented form of recording device across many cultures worldwide, and versions of them appear in the archaeological record of both North America and Mesoamerica. Whether these sticks represent a calendrical system, a counting device, or something else entirely, the precision of their manufacture and the care of their bundling makes clear that they were considered significant enough to carry to this island and leave protected from the elements. They were not garbage. They were not accidental. They were stored. Number 14 was a piece of worked copper, small, barely 2 inches across, hammered into the shape of a bird in flight. The wings were spread, the tail fanned, and the head turned slightly to one side, in a posture that the ornithologist consulted by the team identified tentatively as consistent with a swallow-tailed kite, a bird that still migrates through South Florida in spectacular numbers each spring, and that appears in the ceremonial art of several southeastern cultures. Pure native copper in this quantity and quality does not occur naturally in Florida. The isotopic signature of this piece matched copper from the Great Lakes region, the same deposits that supplied the massive pre-Columbian copper trade across eastern North America. Someone brought Great Lakes copper to the interior of the Big Cypress swamp and shaped it here, or carried a shaped piece all the way from the trade networks of the north. Either way, this small bird represents a physical link between this isolated island and a continental exchange system of extraordinary reach. Leave a comment below right now and tell me, do you think this island was a trading post, a ceremonial site, or something else entirely? I want to know what you think. Number 13 was a complete shark tooth, about 4 inches long from a bull shark, which is a species fully capable of surviving in the freshwater and brackish environments of the Big Cypress watershed. The tooth itself would not be remarkable except for 2 things. First, it had been drilled through the root and strung on a length of braided fiber that was still partially intact, meaning it was worn or carried, not simply found. Second, And more significantly, the face of the tooth had been incised with a small symbol, a single carefully carved mark that matched exactly a symbol from the sandstone tablet described earlier. This is the first direct symbolic connection between two objects on the island. Someone who made or used the sandstone tablet also made or marked this shark tooth. They were not strangers to each other. The objects on this island were not left by different people at different times, or at least not entirely. Some of them form a set. Number 12 was a ceramic figurine, intact, about 4 inches tall, depicting a human or human-like figure in a seated position. The style of the figurine was unlike anything in the documented Florida archaeological record. The face was flat and wide, the eyes rendered as coffee bean-shaped incisions, the mouth slightly open in an expression that different observers have described as surprised, serene, or speaking. The torso was smooth and featureless. The legs were folded in front in a cross-legged position. Figurines of broadly similar type, seated humans with coffee bean eyes, are found in the archaeological traditions of several regions, including the American Midwest, northern Mexico, and parts of the Caribbean. This one does not match any of those traditions precisely enough for a confident attribution. It sits in a category of its own and raises questions that the evidence available does not yet answer. Number 11 was a worked piece of shark vertebra, hollowed out and sealed at both ends with a hardened resinous material. It functioned, in other words, as a container. When the seal was carefully removed in laboratory conditions, the interior was found to hold a small quantity of dry material, mostly degraded but partially identifiable as a mixture of plant matter and mineral powder. The mineral component included red ochre and what appeared to be powdered galena, a lead sulfide mineral with a bright silver-gray color used as a pigment and ritual material at sites across North America for thousands of years. Galena does not occur naturally in South Florida. The nearest sources are in Missouri and Illinois, over 1,000 miles away. Someone carried powdered galena to this island and sealed it inside a shark vertebra for safekeeping, or for someone else to find. Subscribe right now if you haven't already, because we still have 10 more objects to get through, and the next few are where this story gets genuinely hard to explain. Number 10 was a length of knotted cord, about 3 feet long, made from braided plant fiber of exceptional quality, the individual strands so fine they appear almost woven. Along the cord, at irregular intervals, were 37 knots of 5 different sizes. Knotted cord as a recording device is most famously associated with the quipu of Andean South America, but versions of knotted record-keeping appear in indigenous traditions across a much wider geography, including in the Caribbean and parts of Mesoamerica. The specific arrangement of knots on this cord has been analyzed by a researcher specializing in pre-Columbian recording systems, who concluded that the distribution of knot sizes does not appear to be random and may encode numerical information, but that without a key or comparative examples, the content cannot be read. This is a document written in a language no one currently knows how to translate. It was found in a Florida swamp, and it has been sitting in a laboratory drawer for 7 years. Number 9 was the most visually striking object on the island. It was a carved wooden mask, roughly life-sized, depicting a face with exaggerated features, deep-set eyes ringed with incised circles, a wide, flat nose, and a mouth carved open in a silent shout or song. The surface had been painted, the paint largely gone, but traces of red, black, and white still visible in the carved recesses. The wood was identified as Cypress, local material, but the carving style was not local. The closest stylistic parallels identified by researchers were wooden masks recovered from Key Marco and from Calusa ceremonial contexts at other South Florida sites. But this mask shared enough divergent features, particularly the circular eye treatment and the open mouth, to suggest either a different hand or a different tradition influencing the same region. Masks of this type in Calusa contexts are believed to have represented supernatural beings, ancestors, or the spirits associated with specific animals and natural forces. Whatever face this mask was meant to show, someone decided this island was where it needed to stay. Number 8 was a stone axe head, ungrooved, about 5 inches long and 3 inches wide, made from a fine-grained greenstone that is not native to South Florida. Greenstone axes of this type appear in the archaeological record of the Archaic period across the eastern United States, some of them dating back 4,000 to 5,000 years. The specific greenstone of this axe head matches sources in the southern Appalachian Mountains, a lithic tradition that was being traded widely before recorded Florida history begins. Whether this axe is ancient or was already an antique when someone brought it to this island, it was clearly not a working tool. The edge showed no use where. It had never been used to cut anything. It was brought here as an object of significance in its own right, possibly as an heirloom or a ceremonial piece, possibly as a marker of connection to something old and far away. Comment below right now and tell me, what would you have done if you had been the one to find this island? Would you have told anyone? Number 7 was a fired clay disc, about 3 inches in diameter and half an inch thick, with a small hole drilled through the center, of the type that archaeologists call a spindle whorl, a weight used to add momentum to a hand spindle when spinning fiber into thread. Spindle whorls are common finds at agricultural settlements where textile production was a significant activity. The Calusa were primarily maritime foragers, not farmers, and spindle whorls are not commonly found in Calusa archaeological contexts. But this whorl's clay composition matched soils from the Lake Okeechobee Basin, and the decorative incisions on its face, a series of radiating lines from the central hole, matched decorative conventions documented at Belle Glade culture sites around Lake Okeechobee, a distinct cultural tradition from the Calusa with its own complex history stretching back over 2,000 years. Someone from the lake was here, or someone carried this small clay disc a very long way from the lake to this island. Number 6 was a fragment of worked bone, about 3 inches long, that had been incised with a series of tiny, closely spaced marks along both edges and across the flat face, creating a dense field of notation that resembles nothing else found on the island. The bone is mammalian, large mammal, possibly manatee given the cortical thickness. Manatees were an important resource for Calusa and related peoples, and appear frequently in the faunal record of South Florida archaeological sites. But this piece of bone appears to have been selected not for its utility as a tool, but specifically for its surface area, which has been used to the maximum extent possible for whatever was being recorded. A researcher in archaeoastronomy examined the marks under magnification and noted that certain recurring sequences of notches could be consistent with lunar cycle tracking, though she was careful to describe this as a possibility rather than a conclusion. The bone is small enough to fit in a closed fist. It may contain more information per square centimeter than any other object in this collection. Number 5 was a glass bead, a single blue glass bead of a type that was traded by Spanish explorers and missionaries across Florida beginning in the late 1400s. At first, this might seem to undercut the mystery. A glass bead from European contact is hardly mysterious. But placed in context, it raises a specific and pointed question. The other objects on this island show no evidence of contact with European material culture. The ceramics are pre-contact. The copper is pre-contact. The carved wood and shell and bone all fit within a pre-contact Florida indigenous tradition. This single bead appears to have been added to the collection, placed deliberately among the other objects, at a moment when someone on this island had access to European trade goods. That means someone was still coming here, still treating this place as significant, during or after the period when Spanish ships first appeared off the Florida coast. The island was not abandoned when history changed. Someone kept coming back. Number 4 was a carved wooden figure, about 7 inches tall, depicting an animal that stands on 4 legs with a long body, a broad flat head, and a heavily ridged back. The carving is detailed enough to make the identification relatively confident. This is an American alligator, rendered with the kind of observational precision that comes from long familiarity with the animal. The alligator's mouth is slightly open, and inside the carved mouth is a smaller carved object. A tiny human figure, sitting upright in the alligator's throat with its hands raised. This detail is not decorative improvisation. In the documented ceremonial art of South Florida indigenous cultures, the alligator is associated with the underworld, with the boundary between the living and the dead, and with the journey that takes place at that boundary. A human figure inside an alligator's mouth is a deliberate theological statement about where the human figure is, and where it is going. This small carved piece is a cosmological map in wood. Number 3 was a piece of incised shell, a large section of lightning whelk shell that had been flattened and smoothed on its inner surface to create a working surface roughly 4 inches by 3 inches. On that surface, in deeply incised lines that had been rubbed with black pigment to make them stand out, was a map. Not a symbolic diagram. A map. The cartographic researchers who examined photographs of it identified a central body of water surrounded by land masses with channels and passes marked between them, along with a series of small symbols placed at specific points that may represent landmarks, settlement locations, or places of particular significance. The geographic correspondence most suggested by the shape of the water body and the surrounding land masses is the estuary system of the southwestern Florida coast, the 10,000 islands, and the Gulf margin, rendered in a way that reflects intimate, practical geographic knowledge. Someone who knew the water made this map, and they brought it to this island in the interior of the swamp, which raises the question of what this island meant in that coastal geography, what role this remote, elevated piece of dry ground played in a world built on water. Number 2 was a piece of worked stone that the geology team spent 3 days on before reaching a conclusion that none of them had expected. It was approximately hand-sized, roughly oval, and its surface had been ground smooth on both faces. The stone itself was a dense gray chert that outcropped, according to the analysis, in a formation more than 900 miles from the Big Cypress, in what is now Central Texas. Someone carried a piece of Texas chert to South Florida, or it passed through so many hands in a continental trade network that its origin had become completely detached from its current location. The smooth ground surfaces suggested it had been used as a polishing or grinding tool, which makes it, superficially, the most utilitarian object in the entire collection. But a grinding stone made from Texas chert, found on a remote island in the Florida swamp alongside masks and maps and copper birds, is not a utilitarian object. It is a relic of a journey so long that we can barely trace its outline. And now we reach number 1. This is the object that Marcus Delaney photographed last, in the fading light of that October afternoon in 2017, after spending 4 hours walking slowly around an island that should not have existed in the way it did. He has said in the time since that he almost missed it, because it was the most unassuming thing there, sitting in a small natural hollow in the limestone at the very center of the island's high ground, covered with a flat piece of bark that had been placed over it deliberately, like a lid. Under the bark was a clay vessel, small, about the size of a baseball, sealed at the top with a plug of hardened resin. The vessel itself was hand-formed and fired, undecorated on the outside, ordinary in every way that pottery can be ordinary. But inside it, when the seal was opened months later in a conservation laboratory in Gainesville, was a piece of folded bark paper. Not animal hide, not stone, paper. Bark paper of the type produced by processes documented in Mesoamerican cultures, specifically the Amate paper tradition associated with cultures from central Mexico, where bark from fig trees was beaten, dried, and produced in sheets that could be folded, written on, and preserved. The bark has been identified as likely fig species, consistent with Amate production. On its surface, in faded black and red pigment, were symbols arranged in rows, a short text of some kind, covering both sides of a piece of paper, roughly the size of a playing card when unfolded. The symbols have been compared to every known and partially known writing system, with connections to the pre-Columbian Americas. They do not match any of them exactly, but structural analysis of the symbol distribution, the way certain characters recur, the apparent presence of separator marks between sequences, suggests that this is a genuine writing system being used to convey information, not a decorative arrangement. Someone wrote something down, sealed it in a clay vessel, covered it with bark, and left it at the center of an island in the middle of the Big Cypress swamp. It is either the most important archaeological find in Florida history, or a mystery that will outlast everyone currently working on it. At this point, 7 years in, both things are true simultaneously. The paper is real, the writing is real, and no one knows what it says. Here is what I want you to sit with after this video. The Big Cypress National Preserve covers nearly 700,000 acres of cypress swamp, pine flatwoods, and wet prairie in South Florida. Systematic archaeological survey has covered a fraction of that area. The island Marcus Delaney found was not in any database. It was not on any map. He found it because a Florida panther's GPS collar led him into a part of the swamp where almost no one goes. There are hundreds of islands like it in the preserve, maybe thousands. Each one a potential raised platform of dry ground in a flooded landscape. Each one a potential place where someone long ago decided to put something down and leave it. The 20 objects on this island tell a story of connection. A story of people moving across vast distances, carrying ideas and materials and symbols between the Gulf Coast and the Great Lakes and the interior of a continent, meeting at a remote elevated patch of ground in the middle of a swamp that apparently everyone who knew about it agreed was worth the journey. We don't know who they were. We don't know when they started coming. We don't know what the paper says. But we know they were here. And we know they thought this place was important enough to bring their most significant things to and leave them. That is not nothing. That is actually everything. Drop a comment right now and tell me which of these 20 objects hit you the hardest and why. I read every single comment on this channel, and this is exactly the kind of conversation I make these videos to start. Subscribe if you haven't already. Share this with someone who thinks the story of this continent begins in 1492, and I will see you in the next one.